You mentioned therapy, therapists, things like that. You'll notice when you talk about therapy culture, if you pry long enough, what people like about their therapists is that they basically provide to them someone to speak to. And it is true, as we've both mentioned, that there has been a social degradation in this country, and that is very bad. But the answer to that is not to become weaker and become more whiny about things. The answer is to actually try and go about fixing that, which you can only do through strength. And you're not going to convince me that some 93 IQ, 27-year-old with a psych degree is really going to provide insight into my problems that my dad won't or my grandpa won't or what have you. Women saying, well, I wish my man would be more open about his emotions. Of course she said that. I can't figure out what he's thinking. Try it. I dare you to try if you're really upset about something, that's fine. I respect that. Every day, complain to your woman. Complain about, not your woman. I shouldn't say that. That's possessive. Complain to your partner about what your respective problems may be. See how far that gets you. She will pretty soon portray or perceive you to be weak, and she will not be interested in you for very much longer after that. In most cases, there are exceptions, but this is a tendency that does exist. In terms of it makes them happier he said it doesn't make them happier being slaves to biology, being in these relationships. But the metric for that he cited was they report more feelings of stress, of struggling, of being unhappy temporarily. That's sure. But like we said in the data that was cited in my intro, of the women who are the happiest, they are all those who have said they've had to make concessions and sacrifices for their family. That is what meaning is, making sacrifice for something that is greater than oneself, being stressed out, dealing with obnoxious children. I'm not pretending that it's this very happy experience. It is stressful, but ultimately the magic that you will be able to create in that child's life as a parent is greater than anything else that you could ever pursue on this planet. That is true. MLK challenging the power structures. What? You mean the federal government that was on his side and literally had white students at bayonet when they were forcing integration? That power really speaking truth to all the billionaires in society who benefited from that. Watch the video. In terms of the APA guidelines, what he's referring to there are some guidelines that were issued by the APA, which of course is notoriously bipartisan, talking about how these harmful standards of masculinity hurt men's feelings. This was basically laughed at. There were multiple studies, including one that was peer-reviewed by about 12 different scholars, saying that not only does this not reflect the data that we have on males and females, it's actually clinically not even useful and perhaps might even be more harmful than it would be useful in addressing the problems that males might be more likely to feel. The fat women are attractive. Opposite is the case. Men, because men, status, resources. I am sorry to say this, but there has not been a case in human history where people have looked at fat women and been nice. It doesn't exist. And also, even if that is the case, who in those other cultures? Maybe it is true, but it's standards. Who is sending these letters to the pygmies in Africa, to people in Iran, to people in Venezuela, Vietnam? Who is telling these people you actually have to be really stoic and you have to be the provider and the protector? These things are downstream from our biology. He has not been able to actually acknowledge the implication of that. He'll say, of course, the fact that men and women are different, true. But he refuses to get into the implications of that in terms of how it affects our behavior differently, which is universally the same throughout the world, throughout world history, and also with babies. If it were true that neuroplasticity, you would expect to see a little bit of leeway. Maybe if we're ambitious 50-50. I would even settle with 10%, but it's not. It is virtually always the same. And that is because men are men, women are women, and I'm kind of like an Aristotelian natural law kind of guy, kind of like a Jesus kind of guy. So if you are following that which you are programmed to do, chances are it's going to optimize your capacity for flourishing as a human being. Right now, contrary to my opponent's belief, the institutions are actively dissuading people, actively making it more difficult to get married, to meet a moral spouse. But that does not mean that our biology has changed. And perhaps there's a reason for the fact that the individual who is the most likely to benefit from the freedom of my opponent's ideas is also the profile of the most depressed person in this country. That is the middle-aged, single, working woman with no children. Why is she the most depressed if she has had the most to benefit throughout the last 60 years of social engineering? And if she isn't the most depressed, or if she is, but it's just a temporary dip, we're buying at the dip, let me know when the uptake is, and I'll look forward to egalitarian, gender-inclusive Wakanda or something.
All right, Hunter, you have 10 minutes for your closing before we move on to the Q&A.
I'm probably not going to need 10 minutes. So, John, you keep going back to the biology thing, and then I just keep saying the same thing, and then it's a repeat constantly. So I already have acknowledged that there is biological differences, and even if people are behaving certain ways because of their biology, that's fine. None of that is the problem. The problem is when you try to enforce this, when you try to stigmatize people who do not adhere to your preferred version of these gender roles. You even did it just a minute ago when you started talking about therapy. You associated therapy with weakness, with being weak. It is not weak to seek help for your mental well-being. That is not weakness. And the fact that you're considering it to be weak is, again, demonstrating my point. This idea that if men are vulnerable, or they show emotion, or they go to therapy, that they're somehow weak or lesser of a man, that is contributing to more depression, that is contributing to higher suicide rates for men, and that's also contributing to the potential to destabilize marriages, as I've already said in my opening. You also talk about men being strong and strength and how important that is. Strength is important across the board. This strength is not something that's only important for men. Everybody should be strong in their own respect. And one of the ways you can be strong is also by being vulnerable, is also by recognizing the time and the place to express emotions, even if that is uncomfortable. A strong person is able to be in touch with their emotions and work through that through a healthy way, not by just suppressing it and being stoic because I gotta be a man, bro. You talk about how quickly your partner would get fed up if you're constantly complaining to them. I agree. Talking about your emotions is not the same thing as complaining. Nobody likes a complainer, but talking about your emotions is not the same thing as complaining all the time to your partner. You also talk about women being happier when they've sacrificed for their family. I think this is a perfect example of a really good value that doesn't need to be gendered. The idea that you should sacrifice for your own desires for the family, yes, you should. If you have a family, then sorry, you are in many ways no longer number one. You do have to make sacrifices, but this isn't just for women, this isn't just for men, and if women were happier, I'm sure that you can find studies that show that men are happier as well, because having children and having a family is one of the best and most fulfilling experiences that you can have in life. So this is a perfect example of where something does not need to be gendered. A lot of these ideas that I think you push for under the guise of traditional gender roles are not necessarily bad. Provide for your family. Be strong when the time and the place is appropriate. These are good things. Be the breadwinner. Provide for your family. All of these things I agree with. I don't agree with you wanting to stigmatize people who break away from that, and I also don't agree that these need to be gendered. I think that a lot of these values are really good values to have, but they're good values for everybody to have. And I think that that's really the most important thing that we should be looking at. So at the end of the day, gender roles are largely influenced by society. We can make a change, and if we can acknowledge where some of these expectations are doing harm, then that means that we can all work towards making a better future for men, for women, and for the stability of the nuclear family. So these are all the reasons why I don't think that traditional gender roles need to be enforced. Thank you.
Thank you, Hunter, and thank you, John. So I'll give a round of applause to our debaters, please.